What's up, YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I don't think the Brooklyn Nets are going to win a championship this year. So, we're in a very unique part of the NBA season where we're deep enough into the year where we feel very familiar about who these players and teams are, but not yet at the finish line to where anyone can be confident about these concise assessments that many people want to make. Because of this, Steph Curry can have an amazing month of April, and now all of a sudden he's now the winner of the MVP award, and the New York Knicks can go on a winning streak, and now all of a sudden they're in conversations to make the conference finals. I know, all sounds crazy unless you're a New York Knicks fan, and so with us being at that stage of the NBA season, I guess my hot take would be that I don't believe that the Brooklyn Nets are going to win the championship. Matter of fact, I would go as far as saying that I don't even believe the Brooklyn Nets will make the NBA Finals. Which, I know, sounds crazy, right? The Brooklyn Nets, they have a team assembled with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, James Harden, and as time has continued to progress, they've added even more offensive weapons. However, when I look at exactly who this team is, what they bring to the table, the pros and the cons, quite frankly, I just cannot confidently state that they are playing at a championship level. And a huge reason for this has to do with their defense. The Brooklyn Nets are one of the worst defensive teams in the NBA. So is that a recipe for a championship caliber team, even if you are playing at an all-time high when it comes to your offensive productivity? Well, let's look at the numbers. First, let's go back all the way to the 1980s and look at all of the teams that ended up making the finals and how well they performed on the defensive end of the court. The best way to assess this is to look at relative defensive rating, which essentially just means what is the defensive rating in contrast to the league average for that year. So essentially that just means if the league average defensive rating is 100 and a team has a defensive rating of 97, that means that their relative defensive rating would be a -3 because the margin is less than 3. And of course, when it comes to defensive rating, the lower the number, the better. So after gathering all the data, on the screen you can see all 82 teams that have made the finals since 1980. And as you can clearly see, there's a lot of relative defensive ratings that are in the negative. Quite frankly, as you can also clearly see, most of the teams on this list have a -3 or a -2.5 relative defensive rating, which means that they were noticeably above average defensively. And if you continue to look at the graphic, as you can clearly see, there were very few teams to make an NBA Finals with a below average defensive rating. And again, this is just making the finals. But then if we were to highlight all the teams that were going to win the championship, as you can clearly see, there is only one team since 1980 to win a championship with a below average defense. And that team is the 2001 Los Angeles Lakers. But there is a lot of context that is needed with the 2001 Lakers. Even though, yes, it is true, during the regular season, the Lakers had a defensive rating that was noticeably below average, and to be specific, it was a defensive rating of 104.8. However, when the postseason began, the Los Angeles Lakers had a defensive rating of 97.9, increasing their defensive rating so much so that it would be on par with other all-time great defensive teams throughout NBA history. Furthermore, on average, teams that made the NBA Finals had an average relative defensive rating of -2.97, and the teams that would go on to win the championship had a relative defensive rating of -3.6. To put that in context, the Brooklyn Nets this year have a relative defensive rating of 1.7. So in short, history is against the Brooklyn Nets. There's never been a team that is this bad defensively who has ever won a championship without increasing their defensive productivity in the postseason. Something that I honestly don't believe the Nets have the capability of doing so. But to the credit of Brooklyn, and I guess this is the other side of the argument, the concept of just outscoring your opponent is something that normally just doesn't work. However, the Brooklyn Nets have found a formula of doing so, and they have been able to do so even with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden very rarely playing alongside one another. So far this year, the Brooklyn Nets have a win percentage of 67.7, and if this was a normal regular season, that means that they would be on pace to win north of 55 games. That is extremely impressive, not only just because of the injuries, but again, the lack of defensive presence. Because throughout NBA history, it is very rare to find a team that is that successful in the regular season while being this bad defensively. And to be a bit more specific, these are all the teams on the screen since the 1980 season that have had a comparable offense and defense to the Brooklyn Nets while still having a similar win pace. Now, unfortunately, none of these teams make the finals, let alone win a championship, and actually a handful of these teams were not even able to make it out of the first or second round. The most successful out of the bunch are the 1988 Boston Celtics, the 1990 Chicago Bulls, and the 2010 Phoenix Suns, who were all able to make it to the conference finals. Now, there are some context that is needed with the Celtics and the Bulls because both of them were dealing with injuries, but also it's very important to highlight that both of those teams saw an increase in defensive productivity in the postseason. So using them isn't necessarily fair. However, the 2010 Phoenix Suns, I believe, is a great example of a team that was just quite frankly outscoring everyone and was really close to winning the championship. And here's what's even crazier. When they lost to the Los Angeles Lakers in the conference finals, it's not like the Suns had a bad offensive series. They actually had an offensive rating of nearly 120, which back in 2010 was basically unheard of. The problem was, though, is that defensively they were just so bad that when they matched up against a near elite offensive team like the Lakers, that the Lakers offensive rating jumped all the way to 124. And the reason why this is so concerning is because you can see a similar trend happen with the Brooklyn Nets this year when all three stars are playing on the court with one another. Now, I get it, this is a very small sample size, so please hold this argument with a grain of salt. But within these 7 games in which KD, Kyrie, and Harden were all available and playing, the Brooklyn Nets had an amazing offensive rating of 120.8. However, their defensive rating was 117.1. Now, technically speaking, they're still outscoring their opponent, but the problem is that most of those teams are horrible offensively, and the fact that on average the offensive rating of the opposing team could jump to 117 again is very reminiscent of what we saw in the 2010 Phoenix Suns. But even with that bit of information, it is still very hard to deny the fundamental flaws with a lot of teams in NBA history who have overly depended on their offense, and that is their predictability. Even Shawn Marion, who played on some of those mid-2000 Phoenix Suns teams, has openly admitted the reason why it was easy to stop them in the playoffs is because how routine, mundane, and predictable their offense was.
Like, that's the difference. You know what I'm saying? When you got one guy who gets the ball and he gets to dictate what's going on, who gets it, and all that stuff, no wonder everybody said we was predictable. San Antonio was the first thing that come up their mouth. When you go back and look at the stuff, you know, a lot of the coaches and everybody be like, oh, we knew we were going to beat y'all in the playoff series. Y'all predictable.
And even though enough people are not praising the Brooklyn Nets about this, because the Nets could easily just be one of the most heavy ISO teams in NBA history, and they would still be highly efficient. But if you look at the Brooklyn Nets and you break down their offense, quite honestly, they actually have a pretty diverse offensive set. If you compare this year's Brooklyn Nets offensive schemes to a team like the 2018 Houston Rockets, as you can clearly see, even though the Brooklyn Nets have more offensively talented players who might have actually needed to do more than both Harden and Chris Paul during the 2018 run due to injuries. However, the Nets still ISO fewer times. The ball handler out of a pick and roll scores less in the Brooklyn Nets system than it does in the Houston Rockets system back in 2018. And the amount of spot up jumpers that the Nets rely on is not at the same level as the Rockets either. The offense is just more diverse, which is ironic because the biggest criticism for the Nets heading into the season, and even when they added James Harden, is that they were just going to heavily depend on isolation or pick and roll, which again just isn't the case. And what's even scarier is because of this level of versatility, as well as just the talent that is on the roster, in every aspect of just scoring the basketball, the Nets are extremely efficient, practically top 10 in efficiency in every aspect of scoring. Which is why this conversation is just so interesting. All the numbers and history points to the fact that the Brooklyn Nets are not supposed to win this year. Regardless of talent, regardless of skill, regardless of efficiency, historically speaking, you need to have at least an average defense to go on to win the championship, preferably a borderline elite one. And it is very interesting to see what's going to happen when they face teams like the Milwaukee Bucks or the Philadelphia 76ers, teams that offensively are either average or elite level while still having elite level defense. But if there is a team to pull this off, it would be the Brooklyn Nets. If you go back and you just look at all of the teams that dominated offensively but were mediocre on the defensive end, all of them suffered from the same offensive disease, which is being too predictable, which is something that the Nets just don't struggle with. But it will be interesting because if one player just has an off night, or if somebody isn't 100% healthy, the odds of them winning the championship or again, even making the finals drops even more. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Please let me know what you think about the video, the Brooklyn Nets, the Eastern Conference, who's going to win the championship, all of that in the comment section. Also, make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, as well as hit the notification bell when you want to be updated when I upload videos on this channel. And until next time, I will see you all later. Peace.